The name on her lips had not been her own in 3 years, and she had grown so accustomed to the silence of it that she had almost forgotten the sound. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, was not the kind of place a woman went to disappear. It was too loud for that, too full of cattle drovers and land speculators and men who drank their wages down to the last cent before riding north again. The railroad had come through only a few years prior, and with it had come the particular restlessness that follows iron tracks the way crows follow a plow. But a woman with enough determination could disappear even in a loud place. She only had to become someone else entirely, and Effie Grayson had become very good at that. She called herself Me now. Me Walsh. She had chosen Walsh because it had belonged to a woman she once read about in a newspaper clipping, a woman who had crossed the Rockies alone and arrived in California without apology. She had chosen me because it was plain enough that no one would ask after it. Plain names did not invite questions. She worked at the Cottonwood Inn, a 2-story establishment on the main road that served decent meals and offered rooms that were clean, if not exactly comfortable. The woman who owned it was called Mrs. Dora Haney, and she was a broad-shouldered widow of 60 with iron-gray hair and the kind of practical kindness that expressed itself in extra bread at supper rather than in spoken words. Dora had taken Effie on without much ceremony, asking only whether she could cook and whether she had references. Effie had said yes to the first and offered a folded letter to the second. The letter had been written by herself, but Dora had never looked closely at the handwriting. Effie was 24 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned so tightly at the back of her skull that it gave her a slightly severe look, and she had eyes the color of good river water, greenish-gray and changeable depending on the light. She was not tall, but she moved with a kind of careful efficiency that made her seem capable of more space than she occupied. She had learned to keep her head slightly down and her expression neutral, the way a woman learns when she has spent time being looked at too carefully. She had been born in Missouri, in a town called Clover Creek, which no longer existed in the way it once had. She had grown up in a white clapboard house with a vegetable garden and a father who played fiddle on the porch in summer evenings, and a mother who could put up 30 jars of preserves in a single afternoon. She had had a younger brother named Thomas who had dark hair and their father's laugh. She had had a life, in other words, that was full and specific and real. She did not speak of any of it. Not the house, not the garden, not Thomas or the fiddle or the preserves. And she did not speak her name, her real name, the name her mother had given her when she was born on a Tuesday morning in 1854, with the spring rain coming down outside and her father pacing the hallway in his good boots. The name she had carried for 21 years before a man called Harlan Cole had taken it from her. She did not think of Harlan Cole if she could help it. But some mornings she woke up with his voice still in her ears, that particular low certainty of it, and she had to lie very still for a moment, reminding herself where she was. She was in Caldwell, Kansas. She was Me Walsh. She worked at the Cottonwood Inn. She was safe. That was the word she returned to on those mornings. Safe. The morning Aaron Ashford rode into Caldwell was an ordinary one by all external appearances. The sky was the pale bright blue of early October, the kind of sky that sits very high and clear above the plains, and the main road was busy with the usual traffic of the cattle season's tail end. Effie was carrying a tray of coffee cups from the kitchen to the dining room when she heard the horse come up outside, and she did not look up, because she had learned long ago that looking up too quickly at arrivals was a habit she could not afford. But she heard him come in through the front door, and she heard him speak to Dora in the hallway, and his voice was not like Harlan Cole's voice at all. It was quieter than that. It had a kind of considered quality to it, as if the man who owned it chose his words with some care before setting them loose. He said he needed a room for a week, possibly 2. He said he had been riding since Wichita and he would be grateful for a hot meal. He said please without being asked to. Dora called through to Effie a moment later. Me, set another place at the table, would you? Effie said another place. Aaron Ashford came into the dining room and sat at the long table nearest the window. He was 30 years old, though she would not know that for some time. He was tall in the particular way of men who have spent years in the saddle, wide through the shoulders and narrow through the hips, with hands that were calloused but careful. He had dark brown hair that was a little long at the collar, and a jaw that could have used a razor recently but had not met one. His eyes were a deep, warm brown, the kind of brown that seemed to take in a great deal without advertising what it took in. He wore a marshal star on his coat. It was not polished the way some men's stars were, the kind men wore to announce themselves. It was simply there, doing its job without ceremony. Effie set the coffee in front of him without meeting his eyes. She recited the menu the way she always did, flat and precise, and he listened without interrupting, which was already more than most men at that table managed. He ordered eggs and biscuits and asked whether the coffee was fresh. She said it was. He thanked her, meaning it. She went back to the kitchen and did not think about him again for the rest of the morning. That was what she told herself, at any rate. He was still at breakfast when the trouble started. It was not dramatic trouble, or at least not the kind that involves guns, which was something. 2 of the drovers from the cattle camp east of town had come in for their own breakfast, and one of them, a red-faced man named Burkett, had taken a particular interest in the other young woman who worked the mornings at the inn, a girl called Clara who was perhaps 19, and had the misfortune of being pretty in a way that certain men took as a form of invitation. Effie had seen this kind of thing before. She knew exactly how it escalated if it was not interrupted. She had also been Clara's age once, and she knew what it was to have no one step in front of you. She stepped in front of Clara. She did it smoothly, refilling Burkett's coffee cup and drawing his attention to his half-eaten plate, telling him in a pleasant but absolutely final voice that Clara was needed in the kitchen and that she would be seeing to his table from here on. Burkett gave her a considering look that was unpleasant in the way such looks are. He started to say something. "More biscuits, Mr. Burkett," Effie said. There was a pause. "Sure," Burkett said and went back to his breakfast. She felt Aaron Ashford's gaze on her from across the table, not the way Burkett had looked, not assessing or calculating, just present, as if he had noticed something and filed it away. She did not acknowledge it. The rest of breakfast proceeded without incident. Clara thanked her in the kitchen, quietly and with genuine feeling, and Effie nodded and told her to make sure she never let herself be caught in a corner. Clara said she would try. Effie thought that trying was not enough but did not say so, because Clara was young and had not yet been taught by hard experience. Aaron Ashford left a generous coin beside his empty plate when he went upstairs to his room. Effie found it when she cleared the table. She stood there for a moment holding it in her palm, not because of its value but because of the plainness of the gesture. No note, no comment. Just the acknowledgement that the meal had been worth something. She put it in her apron pocket and went on with her morning. He stayed, as he had said he might, for 2 weeks. And in that time, Caldwell revealed itself to be exactly as complicated as any border town in Kansas in the late 1870s deserved to be. The cattle drives had slowed with the season, but the men who had been deposited in town by the end of the drive were not always quick to leave, and there were disputes over wages and disputes over cards, and the particular violence that comes from men who are far from home and have had too much of nothing to do. Aaron handled these things with a calm that Effie observed over the course of many mornings at the inn's dining table. He did not seem to enjoy the exercise of authority. He did not seem to be proving anything. He went about his work the way a man goes about repairing a fence, because it needed doing, and he was the one who was there. He ate at the inn twice a day when he was in town, breakfast and supper. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which Effie appreciated more than she could have easily articulated. He talked when he had something to say. He asked Dora about the history of the inn and actually listened to her answer. He asked Clara whether her family was in the area and seemed genuinely interested when she said they were, up near Dodge City, With Effie in those first days, he was simply polite. "Good morning." "Thank you. The eggs are very good." He did not probe, and he did not flirt in the way that some men flirted with the women who served them, as if service was a kind of invitation. He treated her with the same courteous respect he offered everyone, no more and no less, and she found that she was able to breathe normally in his vicinity, which was not something she could have said about many of the men who passed through the Cottonwood Inn. On the 5th day of his stay, he came down to breakfast late, when the dining room was empty except for Effie, who was wiping the long table with a cloth. He poured his own coffee from the pot on the sideboard, which surprised her, and he sat down and opened the newspaper he had picked up from the post office and read it for several minutes in silence. Then he folded the paper and set it aside and said, "That drover from yesterday is going to be trouble if he stays." Effie paused her wiping. She had thought the same thing. The drover in question was a narrow-eyed man who had come in with a group and stayed when the group left, spending his evenings at the saloon down the road and his mornings in various states of recovery. "He's been watching the inn," she said. It was more than she usually offered anyone. She was not sure why she offered it now. Aaron looked at her steadily. "I noticed that too. I'll speak to him today. He's the kind that doesn't respond well to speaking." Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've dealt with men like that before." It was not quite a question, and it was not quite a statement. It occupied a careful middle space that asked nothing of her and offered her the option of silence. She said, "Most women have." He accepted that and did not push further, and Effie went back to wiping the table. But she was aware, in the way you become aware of a shift in the weather before you see the clouds, that something had happened between them that was different from the exchanges she had had with every other person in Caldwell, Kansas. He had spoken to her as if she were a person with knowledge worth considering, and she had spoken back. The drover left the following morning. Whatever Aaron had said to him, it had been effective. Effie did not ask what it was. She began to let herself see him more clearly, which was a risk she took very deliberately and with full awareness of its costs. She was not a woman given to impulsiveness. Whatever she had once been, before Harlan Cole and the years that followed, the woman she was now moved carefully through the world, testing her weight on each new piece of ground before committing to it. But she saw that Aaron Ashford was a man who found humor in things without mocking them. She saw that he was genuinely patient with Dora's long stories about the inn's history, and that the patience was not feigned. She saw that he gave a small amount of money to a Pawnee man who came to the back door of the inn asking about work, and that when the man said his family was camped outside of town and there was no work to be found, Aaron wrote something on a piece of paper and gave it to him as well. And she later learned that the paper had directed the man to a rancher north of Caldwell who was fair in his dealings and had mentioned needing hands. She saw all of these things and she stored them away without knowing exactly what she was storing them for. On a Thursday evening, near the end of his first week, Effie was sitting on the back step of the inn after supper, breathing the cool air. October had deepened into something with actual cold in it, and the stars were very bright over the flat land. She heard the back door open and was immediately alert, every part of her oriented toward movement. "Excuse me," Aaron said from behind her. "I didn't mean to startle you." She had pulled slightly forward, ready to stand. She made herself settle back. "You did not startle me," she said, which was mostly true. He stood there for a moment, then sat on the far end of the step, leaving a considerable distance between them. He had a tin cup of coffee, and he held it in both hands against the cold. They sat without speaking for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Then he said, "Do you like it here?" In Caldwell, she considered the question. No one had asked her that, not Dora, who was practical about such things, and not the other women she worked alongside who were busy with their own lives. No one had thought to ask whether she liked it. "It is reliable," she said. He nodded as if that were a complete answer. Perhaps it was. "That's something," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That is something." He looked out at the dark plains. "I've been a marshal for 6 years," he said. "Before that I worked cattle up from Texas." Before that I was in school in Ohio until my father died and there wasn't money for it anymore." He paused. "I'm not sure why I told you that." Effie looked at the stars. "People tell me things," she said. "It happens." "Is it because you're a good listener?" "It is because I do not tell them back," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he laughed genuinely and low, and it was a good sound, the kind that comes from somewhere real. She did not smile exactly, but something around her eyes changed. They sat for another quarter hour in that comfortable silence before the cold drove her inside. She said good night and he returned it, and she climbed the stairs to her small room at the back of the inn's second floor and lay on her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She told herself that she liked talking to him because he was safe to talk to. The marshal's star was part of that, but she was honest enough with herself in the small hours to admit that it was not only the star. It was the specific quality of the man, the care with which he existed. She had not cared about any one specific quality in 3 years. She had not allowed herself to. The following days were busy with the preparation of a cattle buyer's reception that Dora had agreed to host at the inn. There were rooms to be made up and food to be prepared and all the usual chaos of such events, and Effie threw herself into it with the reliable competence that Dora had come to depend upon. She barely saw Aaron except in passing, and when she did see him, she was usually carrying something too heavy, which he had the courtesy not to notice while also managing to hold the door. On the evening of the reception itself, she was carrying a full tray of glasses from the kitchen through the crowded dining room when a man turned without looking, and she collided with him. The tray went sideways. She caught it with a presence of mind that surprised even her, but 2 glasses fell, and the man turned around, red-faced and irritated, and Effie was straightening up and saying that she was sorry when Aaron appeared at her elbow. "They weren't broken," Aaron said pleasantly to the man, who was considerably larger than Aaron but did not seem to find this as useful as he might have. "And she was carrying them for you, so you might let her continue." The man looked at the marshal's star and recalculated. He moved aside with a poorly disguised grunt of displeasure. Aaron picked up the 2 unbroken glasses from the floor and placed them back on the tray. He did it quickly without making a production of it. "Thank you," Effie said. "He should have been watching where he was going," Aaron said. "I should have been more careful." "It was a crowded room," Aaron said, and that was the end of the conversation because they were both in the middle of other things. But she thought about the way he had said it on her behalf, not in the way men sometimes intervene to demonstrate their own strength or importance, but in the way of someone who had simply seen an unfairness and declined to allow it to continue. There was no performance in it. He had not looked at her afterward to see whether she was impressed. She had been, anyway. Dora found her in the kitchen near midnight after the guests had gone when Effie was doing the last of the washing up. Dora leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed and regarded Effie with the particular look she reserved for things she had decided to address. "He's a decent man, that marshal," Dora said. Effie kept her hands in the soapy water. "He seems to be." "He asked me about you," Dora said. The hands stilled for just a moment. "Asked what?" "Whether you were all right. Whether anyone was giving you trouble." Dora's voice was neutral, neither approving nor disapproving. "I told him you were the most capable woman I'd ever employed and that you didn't need looking after." "He said he didn't doubt it. He said he was asking because he wondered." Effie thought about this. "And what did you tell him about me?" "Nothing more than what I said," Dora answered. "I don't know anything more than what I said." A pause. "Do I?" It was the closest Dora had ever come to asking, and it was gentle enough, the question, that Effie could almost have answered it. Almost. "No," she said. "You don't." Dora nodded, accepting this, and went to bed. Effie stood alone in the kitchen for a long while after that, her hands in the cooling water, looking at the dark window above the wash basin. In the glass she could see a faint reflection of herself, the tight hair and the careful expression and the name that was not hers. She thought about what it would be like to say her name, her real name, just once, aloud in her own voice, to hear it come back from the walls. She didn't do it, but for the first time in 3 years she thought about it without terror. The second week of Aaron's stay brought weather. A cold front moved down across the Kansas plains, with the kind of serious intent that only the prairie can manage, dropping temperatures and throwing a rattling, ice-laced rain against the windows of the Cottonwood Inn. The cattle traffic dwindled further, and the town took on the particular hunched quality of a place bracing itself. Aaron had extended his stay, which he informed Dora was due to a matter he had not yet resolved involving a man in the territory who was wanted in connection with a robbery near Wichita. He said this plainly, not explaining more than was necessary, and Dora accepted it with the same practicality she brought to most things. Effie noticed that he had extended his stay. She noticed that she was glad of it and spent a moment examining that gladness with a critical eye, checking it for danger the way she checked everything. She found that it was not dangerous in the way she feared. It was not the feeling of being unable to help yourself, which was how she had felt about Harlan Cole in the early days, before she understood what that feeling was a symptom of. This was something else, something that had warmth in it but also air, something she could breathe inside of. She did not know what to do with that assessment, so she put it aside and went on with her work. On the second day of the cold snap, Aaron came down to breakfast and found that the dining room was occupied by a traveling family who had taken shelter from the weather. A husband and wife and 3 young children who were still damp from the ride in and somewhat stunned-looking. Effie was trying to manage all of them at once, getting the children warm drinks and finding out what the parents needed. Without being asked, Aaron poured himself a cup of coffee from the sideboard and sat at the smallest table, well out of the way, and waited without complaint. When she finally brought his breakfast, apologizing for the delay, he waved the apology off and asked how old the children were. She said she thought the youngest was about 2. He glanced over at the table. The 2-year-old, who had recovered considerably from the cold and rain, and was now demonstrating this by attempting to climb out of her chair, had attracted the interest of her older brother, who was perhaps 5 and appeared to find this incredibly funny. Aaron watched this for a moment with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. Something in it was wistful. Not sad exactly, but the way a man looks at something he has wanted and has not had. She found herself asking before she had entirely decided to, "Do you have family?" He looked up. The expression shifted back to something more familiar. "A sister in Ohio," he said. "She's married with 4 of her own. I don't see them often enough." "No wife." The question was out before she could stop it, and she felt the color rise slightly in her face, which was an experience she had not had in some time. Aaron regarded her with a straightforward, mild look. "No," he said. "I was engaged once some years back. It didn't hold." A pause. "I think she found the idea of being married to a marshal less appealing than the reality." He said it without bitterness. "She was right to be practical about it." "That seems like a generous way to look at it," Effie said. "I had a few years to get there," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in its general direction. She went back to the family at the large table and did not speak to him again until supper, but she carried the conversation with her through the day, turning it over in her hands the way you turn over something small and interesting to see what it looks like from all sides. That evening, after supper, the rain was still coming down and the inn was full of people who had nowhere better to be. Dora had the small parlor open, which she did not always, and there was a fire in it, and several of the guests had drifted in there to read or to play cards. The traveling family's children had been put to bed, and the parents sat across from each other with the loosened look of people who had survived a hard day together. Effie came in to add wood to the fire. Aaron was sitting near the window reading, but he set his book down when she came in, and they fell into a conversation that began about something practical, the route of the family's travel, she thought, and gradually became about other things. He asked her where she was from. She gave him the answer she always gave, which was that she had grown up in the Missouri border region and had been traveling for some years. He accepted this without pressing, the way he accepted most things, and turned the conversation to the landscape of Kansas, which he seemed to find genuinely interesting in a way that was slightly unusual for a lawman who spent most of his time dealing with its more difficult inhabitants. He said that the sky here was the biggest he had ever seen anywhere, and that he still was not entirely accustomed to it after 6 years of working the territory. She said that she had found the sky overwhelming when she first arrived, that she had been used to trees and hills, and that out here you could sometimes feel like you were going to fall upward into it. He looked at her with some interest. "That's exactly it," he said. "That's the exact feeling." "It gets better," she said. "Does it? You realize that the sky cannot actually take you," she said. "You are too heavy for it." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that she could not entirely read, and then he laughed again, that good low sound, and she felt it move through her in a way that was alarming and wonderful in equal measure. After that evening they talked every day. It was not arranged. It simply happened, the way water finds its level. He would come down to breakfast and she would be there, and they would talk over the morning work. And then there would be a moment in the afternoon when one or the other came upon the other in the course of the day, and they would talk again. It was easy in a way that nothing had been easy for Effie in a very long time. She talked to him about the prairie grass, and about the way the light came across the flat land in the late afternoon, and about the black-tailed jackrabbits that appeared in the yard behind the inn in early morning. She talked about cooking, which she had strong opinions about, and about the way weather moved across open country, and about a book she had read twice, a novel she had found on the inn's small shelf of abandoned volumes. She did not talk about Clover Creek or her father's fiddle or her mother's preserves or Thomas's dark hair. She did not talk about Harlan Cole. She talked around all of these things the way you walk around a sinkhole you know is there, with a wide and careful berth. But she talked more than she had talked in 3 years, and she let herself be seen more than she had allowed in 3 years, and some mornings she woke up with his voice in her ears instead of Harlan Cole's, and that felt like something she had not quite expected to receive. He found the wanted man he had been looking for on the second Thursday of his stay. It was not dramatic, at least not from the outside. There was a brief confrontation near the livery stable, which Effie heard about afterward from Clara, who had heard it from the stableman. The wanted man had not gone willingly, apparently, but he had gone, and no one had been seriously hurt, which was how Aaron seemed to prefer these things to resolve. He came to supper that evening with a bruise beginning to show along his jaw, which he appeared to have entirely forgotten about. He sat down and ordered stew and read the newspaper, and Effie set the food in front of him and said, without meaning to, "You have a bruise." He reached up and touched the side of his jaw with the back of his fingers, as if confirming something he had been informed about secondhand. "So I do." She went to the kitchen and came back with a clean cloth she had dipped in cool water. She set it on the table beside him and did not say anything. He picked it up and held it against the bruise. He looked up at her. "Thank you, me." The name landed the way names do when you have worn them long enough, familiarly and without disruption. But she stood there for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, and she thought, "That is not my name." And behind that thought, which was not new, was something new, a tiredness. Not of him, not of Caldwell, not of the work. A tiredness of the particular weight of carrying something false. She went back to the kitchen and stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the work table, and she thought about Harlan Cole, who had taken her name from her not in a single dramatic act, but gradually, through a long process of diminishment that she had not fully understood until she was in the middle of it, and then could not see clearly until she was out of it. Harlan Cole had been her husband. That was the simple fact of it. They had married in 1875, when she was 21 years old, and he had seemed like a man of substance and stability. A man who ran a general store in Clover Creek, and who had good manners and a careful, deliberate way of speaking that she had initially found reassuring. She had been wrong about what that deliberateness meant. It had taken 2 years for her to understand that the stability she had perceived was actually a form of control, and that the good manners were a performance staged for the town's benefit. and that behind the closed door of their house there was a different kind of man entirely. Not a man who struck her, at least not often, and not a man who could be easily accused of specific cruelties. He was more subtle than that. He had spent 2 years quietly taking away every piece of her, every friend and every choice and every word that was hers alone, until she was so small and so silent that she had almost stopped recognizing herself. And then one morning in the spring of 1875, when she had gone to her mother's house to help with a quilting and had sat across from her mother in the good afternoon light and had looked at her mother's face and thought, "This woman would not know me," she had understood that she had to leave. Her father had died the previous winter. Thomas was working a cattle outfit in the Texas Panhandle, and she had not heard from him in months because Harlan had managed their correspondence. Her mother was the only family she had left, and she was sitting across from her mother in the good afternoon light, and they were talking about quilt patterns, and she was slowly disappearing. She had left 3 days later. She had taken what she could carry, which was not much, and she had left her name behind as well, because her name was on documents and on courthouse records and on the letters Harlan sent to Thomas, and she could not risk being found while she was still Effie Grayson. She had become Mee Walsh in a town 2 counties over, and she had been Mee Walsh since. She had written to her mother once, from a town called Pratt in the 2nd year, a letter that said only that she was alive and well, and that she was sorry for the worry she had caused, and that she hoped her mother understood. She had not given a name or a location, and she had not written again because the fear of being traced was always there, just under the surface of things, like a cold current in a warm river. She did not know whether her mother had shown the letter to Harlan. She did not know whether Harlan was still looking. She thought about this less as time went on, but she had not entirely stopped thinking about it. Standing in the cottonwood in kitchen with her hands flat on the work table, she thought, "I am so tired of carrying this." She did not do anything with that thought. She went back to serving supper. But she looked at Aaron Ashford across the dining room, holding the cool cloth to his jaw and reading his newspaper with an expression of complete, uncomplicated calm, and she thought about what it would mean to trust someone with a true thing. 2 days after the arrest, Aaron told Dora that he would be heading back to Wichita at the end of the week to deliver his prisoner and file his reports. He said it at breakfast, with Effie within earshot, and she heard it with a sensation in her chest that she identified, after a moment, as disappointment. She was not pleased to identify it as disappointment. That afternoon she was in the small vegetable garden behind the inn, harvesting the last of the autumn cabbages before the real cold came, when Aaron came around the corner of the building and stopped at the edge of the garden. "I owe Dora some firewood," he said. "She mentioned the pile was getting low." Effie gestured toward the woodpile at the back of the property. He rolled up his sleeves and spent the better part of an hour splitting logs, and she worked in the garden, and they were close enough to talk if they wanted to and far enough apart that they didn't have to. After a while he said, "I've been thinking I might ask to be assigned this region." She looked up from the cabbages. "Caldwell, the territory, Sumner County. There are 3 or 4 towns in the area that have been requesting a more regular law presence." He was looking at the log he was setting up to split, not at her. "It would mean staying around." "Is that what you want?" she asked. He set the hatchet down and looked at her then with that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that asked nothing but was fully present. "I think I have reasons to want it," he said. The words were careful and deliberate and left her room to not respond to them directly, which she took because she was not ready to do otherwise. She looked back at the cabbages. "Caldwell is a decent enough town," she said, which was both true and almost entirely not the point. He picked up the hatchet. "Yes," he said, "it is." That evening he knocked at the door of the small parlor where Effie had been sitting with a mending basket, working by lamplight after Dora and Clara had gone to bed. She startled slightly at the knock and then told herself not to be ridiculous and said to come in. He stood in the doorway. He had something in his hand, a small cloth-bound book. "I found this downstairs," he said. "You mentioned reading it twice. I wanted to see what I'd been missing. It was the novel from the shelf. She had, in fact, recommended it to him several days ago, and he had clearly gone and found it. It is better the second time, she said. Can I ask you something? He came a step into the room, not far, leaving her space. She set the mending in her lap and looked at him. Why do you look like someone who is waiting to have to run? He asked. And immediately before she could answer, he said, You don't have to tell me. I wanted to ask because I thought you might want to be asked. You can tell me it's none of my business. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of the fire. Effie looked at the lamp for a moment and then at him. It is not your business, she said, and then after a pause, but you are right that I was glad to be asked. He nodded. He did not push. I am safe here, she said, which was both an explanation and a limit. Good, he said, and he meant it simply. I'm glad you're safe. He said good night and withdrew, and she sat with the mending in her lap for a long while after, not mending anything, just thinking. She was thinking about what kind of man asks a question the way he had asked that question. Not demanding, not clever, not using the question as a lever. Just asking because he thought she might want to be asked. Just offering her the opening, and then, when she declined to step through it, accepting that with complete equanimity. She had not, in her adult life, met many men who could do that. Her father had been one. There had been a doctor in Pratt who had been one. She had thought for a long time that such men were rarer than they ought to be. Perhaps they were. But here was one, in the doorway of the Cottonwood Inn's parlor, holding a cloth-bound novel and asking if she was all right, with nothing in the asking but genuine care. She was 32 years old in her chest, she thought. She had been carrying too much for too long, and she was tired, and it was making her ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years. But sitting by this fire, in this town, in the orbit of this particular man, she felt something that was almost young again. Something that had not entirely calcified. She finished the mending. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. The next morning before breakfast there was a letter. It arrived with the early mail that the post office delivered to the inn for their guests, and Dora sorted it at the front desk and handed Effie a folded envelope that had been addressed to the Cottonwood Inn. Attention me Walsh. Effie took it without showing anything on her face and put it in her apron pocket and went to start breakfast and did not look at it for an hour, because she had learned that some things needed to be faced at a chosen time rather than when they arrived. When she was alone in the kitchen, she opened it. It was a single sheet of paper, written in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, which was a relief. It took her a moment to work out who it was from, and then she understood. It was from her mother's neighbor, a woman called Mrs. Hopper, who had known Effie since childhood. The letter said that Effie's mother, Ruth Grayson, had passed away in late September. It had been quiet, Mrs. Hopper wrote, and it had been in the home she loved, and she had not been alone. It said that Ruth had left a letter for her daughter, which Mrs. Hopper had been entrusted to send on to any address where me Walsh might be reached, and that the letter was enclosed. There was a second, smaller envelope inside the first. Effie sat down on the kitchen stool and held both envelopes for a moment. The morning sounds of the inn continued around her, distant and irrelevant. She was aware of the precise quality of the light coming through the kitchen window, which was thin and October bright and lay across the floor in a pale rectangle. Her mother was dead. She had last seen her mother across a quilt and a table in a house in Clover Creek more than 3 years ago, and she had not seen her since and would not now, ever. She sat very still for a while. Then she opened the second envelope. Her mother's handwriting was familiar in the particular way of things that are deep in the body's memory, the slant of it, and the way the capital R had a small curl at the foot. It said, My dearest Effie, I hope you are well. I hope wherever you are somewhere with kindness in it. I know why you left. I knew before you did, perhaps, and I am sorry I did not say something sooner. Harlan came here looking for you twice. The first time I told him I had not heard from you. The second time I told him that as far as I was concerned, he had no wife, and I showed him the door. He has not come back. I do not believe he will look for you any longer. He has remarried. A woman from up near St. Joseph, and I pray for her and I think of you every day. Your brother Thomas found work in Colorado and is doing well. He does not know where you are, but he loves you. You were named Effie because your grandmother's name was Euphemia, and you were so loud and so certain when you were born that your father said you needed a name with some standing to it. You have standing, my girl. You always did. Come back to yourself whenever you are ready. You are missed. All my love always, your mother Ruth. Effie sat on the kitchen stool with the letter in her hands and she cried quietly for about 10 minutes. It was the first time she had cried in a very long time, and it was the kind of crying that is necessary and not the kind that signals collapse. When it was done, she felt scraped clean and hollow and slightly lighter. Her name was Effie Grayson. Her mother had written it down. She folded the letters and put them in her apron pocket. She wiped her face with the clean cloth she kept there. She stood up and began making breakfast. When Aaron came down and sat at his usual table, she poured his coffee and set it in front of him, and he looked up and saw clearly that something had happened because he was not a man who missed things. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Are you all right?" She stood there with the coffee pot in her hand and she looked at him and she thought about what her mother had written. "Come back to yourself whenever you are ready. I had some news," she said, "about family." "I'm sorry," he said, not asking what kind, just extending the words the way you extend a hand. She nodded once. Then she said, and she was not entirely sure why she was saying it now except that she was tired and her mother had used her name and it was still echoing in the room of her chest. "My name is not me." The kitchen sounds continued. Outside, a horse went by on the main road. Aaron looked at her with complete, unhurried attention, and there was nothing in his face that she would have wanted to escape. No calculation, no surprise performed for her benefit, no pity that would have been worse than silence. Just that steady, careful warmth. "What is your name?" he asked. And the asking was so gentle, so unhurried, so entirely without demand that she felt it move through her like the first warm day after a long winter. She took a breath. "Effie," she said. And then, because her mother had written it down and it was hers and it had always been hers, "Effie Grayson." The name came out of her mouth and landed in the air between them, and it was her name, entirely her name, and she had not said it in 3 years, and it sounded like coming home. Aaron held her gaze. "Effie," he said, and that was all he said, and it was enough. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and she let the feeling of having said her name wash through her, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had just given herself something back that she had thought was lost. For the rest of breakfast she moved through the dining room and she was, for the first time in 3 years, the woman her mother had named. Not performing safety, not maintaining the shape of me Walsh. She was Effie Grayson, and she was carrying her mother's letter in her pocket, and she was still there. She had not been lost entirely. She was still there. Aaron stayed for breakfast without unusual comment. He ate his eggs and his biscuits and he read his newspaper, and when she refilled his coffee he looked up and said, "Thank you, Effie." And she almost put the coffee pot down on the table because her knees were briefly uncertain, hearing her name in his voice. She managed not to put the coffee pot down on the table. He was leaving in 2 days. She was aware of this. She was also aware that something had shifted between them so significantly in the last 24 hours that she could no longer pretend that it was simply the pleasant companionship of a careful man and a woman who had been lonely for a long time. It was something larger and more specific, and it had her name in it. She went to Dora that afternoon and asked whether she could speak to her privately. Dora poured them both a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Effie with that particular practical attention of hers that was actually quite kind. Effie told her, not everything, but the important things. She said her name was Effie Grayson, not me Walsh. She said she had left a difficult marriage 3 years ago and had been traveling since. She said her mother had died recently and that she had received news that she was no longer in danger of being sought. She said she was sorry for the deception with the false reference letter. Dora listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she drank her tea and said, "I knew you weren't me, Walsh." Effie looked at her. "The handwriting on the reference letter matched yours," Dora said matter-of-factly. "I'm not blind. I just didn't see what it was my business to ask." Effie felt something between relief and the particular feeling of being seen by someone you had not expected to be seen by. "Your name is Effie," Dora said. "All right. You're still the best cook I've had in this inn, and you can stay as long as you want, and what you've told me does not leave this kitchen." "Thank you," Effie said, and then she said it again with more weight in it. "Thank you, Dora." Dora waved her hand in the manner of someone dismissing sentiment before it could become inconvenient. "Don't make a thing of it." Effie laughed, which surprised her. She had not laughed in this kitchen before, she realized. In any kitchen in a long time. That evening she found Aaron on the back step again, the one where they had first spoken. She sat at her usual end of the step and he was at his, and the sky was very large and cold and full of stars. October in Kansas. The grass smell and the distant smell, the specific quality of air that has nothing between you and Colorado for hundreds of miles. "I owe you something," she said. He looked at her, questioning. "You asked me once if someone was giving me trouble. You asked gently enough that I wanted to tell you." She paused. "I couldn't then. I want to try now." He turned slightly toward her on the step, giving her his full attention, and he did not say anything, just was present in the way he had of being present. She told him, not every detail but the shape of it. A marriage that had been suffocating rather than violent. A man who had reduced her through patience and control. The morning at her mother's table when she had understood. The leaving, the name she had taken, the 3 years of careful surviving. She told it plainly, the way her mother had raised her to speak plainly without embellishment or apology. He listened to all of it. He did not say anything for a moment when she finished. Then he said, "I'm glad you left when you did." Not, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Not, "What a terrible man." Not, "You should have done this or that differently." Just, "I'm glad you left when you did." "I am too," she said. "Now." "What do you mean now?" She looked at the stars. "For a long time I was not sure. You leave and you are free of the thing, but you are also free of everything else, the home and the family and the name. And for a while the weight of the freedom is heavier than the weight of the cage." She paused. "I think I am past that now. Because of your mother's letter. Because of several things," she said, and she did not look at him, but she knew he understood that he was one of the several things. A long silence. The cold was deepening. A coyote called somewhere out on the plain, distant and wild. "I'm going to ask Wichita for the Sumner County assignment," Aaron said. "I wasn't sure before this week whether I wanted to stay. I'm sure now." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the plain. "I think I've been ready to stay somewhere for a while," he said. "I just needed to find a somewhere that was worth staying in." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should know that I am not entirely fixed. I am better than I was. But there are mornings that are harder than others, and I am still learning to trust my own judgment about people, and I do not yet know what I want my life to look like except that I want it to be mine." "I know that," he said. "And then I'm not asking you to be fixed, Effie. I'm asking if you'll let me stay." His voice on her name, Effie, her actual name in his actual voice. "Yes," she said. "I'll let you stay." He rode out the following morning as planned, to deliver his prisoner to Wichita and file his reports and request the territorial assignment. Before he left, he came to breakfast and ate at his usual table, and when she set his coffee down, he looked up at her with that warm, steady look. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded as if this were a fact of the landscape, settled and reliable, and he finished his breakfast and rode out in the bright cold of the October morning, and she watched the road after he was gone for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went and wired her brother Thomas at the address her mother's letter had contained. It was a short telegram. It said, "I am alive, I am well, I am in Caldwell, Kansas. I am Effie Grayson again, write to me." She sent it from the post office on the main road, and walking back to the inn she felt the prairie wind on her face and the sky above her was enormous and blue, and she thought, "You are too heavy to fall upward." And she thought, that is all right. The 2 weeks were, if anything, longer than they needed to be. She kept herself busy, which was not difficult. The inn was full with the tail end of the season's traffic, and the cold had settled in properly now, meaning there was more firewood to be managed, and more soups and stews on the supper menu, and more guests who were traveling rather than driving and who came in with the cold off them and needed warming up in a general sense. She worked hard, and she slept well, which was something she noted as new. She received a letter from Thomas 8 days after her telegram. He wrote from a mining town in Colorado called Silverton, and he wrote in the way of someone who had been holding a great deal for a long time and was finally setting it down. He said he had tried to find her after she left, that he had written to Harlan and been told she had gone, and that Harlan had not known where. He said he had never entirely believed that. He said he had written to their mother, who had told him to be patient and trust. He said he was going to come and see her in the spring, if she would have him, and he said her name 3 times in the letter, which she thought was probably deliberate, and was also the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She wrote back immediately and said, "Yes, come in the spring, I will be here." On a Wednesday in early November, Aaron Ashford rode back into Caldwell. She heard his horse. She told herself she recognized the particular rhythm of it, and that this was not embarrassing. She was in the dining room setting up for supper, and she heard the horse, and something in her entire body came awake in the way it had not been awake for 2 weeks, a kind of particular attention, as if the room had gotten brighter without any lamp being lit. He came through the door with the cold on him, and he looked around the dining room and found her, and his expression, which had been simply tired from the road, changed in a way that was not complicated to read. "Evening," he said. "Welcome back," she said. "Coffee, please," he said. She poured it. He sat at his usual table and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked across the table at her and said, "The assignment came through. I'm Sumner County's marshal, effective the 1st of the year." She felt the warmth of that move through her. "Congratulations," she said. "I'll need to find a proper place to stay," he said, "something more permanent than the inn." "There are several properties available," she said. "I can ask Dora, she knows everyone." "I'll do that." He drank his coffee. "Then how have you been?" The question was so simple and genuine and directed specifically at her, at Effie Grayson, that she answered it honestly. "Better," she said. "Considerably better." She paused. "I heard from my brother." His face opened with genuine pleasure. "Good news." "Very good news," she said. They talked through supper preparation and through supper service itself, finding the conversation in the spaces between tasks the way they had always found it, and there was nothing stiff or ceremonious about it. He was simply back and she was simply here, and the conversation continued from where it had left off. Later, after the dining room had cleared, he asked if she would walk with him. It was cold but dry, and the moon was nearly full, and the main road of Caldwell was silver in it. She put on her coat and they walked, not holding hands because it was too early for that, and they both seemed to understand this, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him beside her. He talked about Wichita, which had grown considerably since the height of the cattle drives and was now a different kind of city, more settled and civic-minded. He talked about his sister in Ohio, whom he had written to while he was there, because she had asked him to be better about letters. He talked about the land north of Caldwell that he had ridden through on the way back, which he had found beautiful in the spare, lay-tautum way of the plains. She talked about Thomas and about Dora, and about a conversation she had had with Clara, who had told her she was going to go home to her family near Dodge City for Christmas, and Effie had told her that was a good idea to go, to not stay away from the people who loved her. "That's what you told her," Aaron said. "Yes." "Was that advice to her or to yourself?" She considered the question honestly. "Both, probably," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They had reached the end of the main road where it opened onto the wider plain, and the moon lay across the flat grass in a way that was almost theatrical, a silver-blue expanse stretching out to the dark horizon. "I want to ask you something," Aaron said, and he said it the way he asked things, with that particular gentleness that left the door of the answer entirely open. She turned to look at him. His face was silver in the moonlight, and his expression was both serious and easy, which was, she had come to understand, simply the way he was. "I want to court you," he said. "Properly. Slowly, in whatever way makes sense to you, at whatever pace you need." He paused. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are right now. I'm not asking you to have anything resolved that isn't resolved. I am just asking if I can try to deserve your trust." The wind moved across the plain, cold and clean, and carrying the smell of the whole enormous country. She thought about the morning she had left Clover Creek with her small bag and her fear, and no name to call herself. She thought about the town in Missouri, and the town near there, and the town in Kansas, where she had been for a year before Caldwell, and all the places she had performed the careful routine of being Mee Walsh. She thought about the kitchen stool and her mother's handwriting, and the way her name had felt when she said it. She thought about Aaron Ashford asking whether she was all right in a way that asked nothing and gave everything. "Yes," she said, "you can try." The winter came down across the Kansas plains with its usual lack of ceremony, dropping temperatures and shortening days, and making the work of the in-particular and busy in the cold weather way. Effie had lived through enough winters to know what they required of you, and she moved through the season with a competence that had, she noticed, acquired something new in it. Not efficiency alone. Something warmer than that. Something that allowed her to notice, and to be glad of what she noticed. Aaron found his accommodations in the form of a small house on the north end of town that a merchant named Caldecott was renting out. A plain two-room structure with a serviceable stove, and a view of the plains to the north that was, as Aaron told her, the best thing about it. He had it by the end of November, and he had it outfitted with the basic essentials by the beginning of December. And if those essentials were more practically than aesthetically arranged, Dora told Effie that this was not surprising, and that most men left to their own devices arranged their homes like they were preparing a camp rather than making a life, and that this was something that could be worked with. Effie did not mention this to Aaron, but she did, one Sunday when she was not working and he had invited her for a walk in the direction of the north property, look through the windows of his small house with a considering eye, and he saw her doing it and said with absolute equanimity that if she had opinions she was welcome to share them. She had several. He received them all with good humor and genuine interest, asking questions and agreeing with some and explaining his reasoning on others, and by the end of the conversation they had determined that the stove needed repositioning slightly and that the single curtain in the main room needed company and that there was room for a bookshelf if someone were to build one. "Can you build a shelf?" she asked. "I can build a passable shelf," he said. "Whether it's a good shelf is a separate question." She looked at the wall he had indicated. "I can help. You can build a shelf. My father could build almost anything, and he taught me more than my mother intended," she said. And she felt the way she said it, the easy, ordinary way of it, as if her father were a thing she could mention without the weight of grief collapsing it. Not that the grief was gone, but it had softened into something she could hold. They built the shelf together the following Saturday, which was not part of any formal courtship plan but was somehow exactly what courtship should be. They argued about joinery in a way that was entirely good-natured and resulted in a shelf that was, in Effie's professional assessment, better than passable. They drank coffee afterward, and she taught him a card game that her mother had played, which he found amusing and was immediately quite good at. He walked her back to the inn in the early dark of a December afternoon, and at the front step he looked at her with that warm and patient expression she had come to love, and he said, "This is the best Saturday I can remember." "You have a poor memory," she said. "I have an excellent memory," he said, "which is how I know." She went inside before she smiled too visibly, but she heard him laugh quietly on the other side of the door, and she stood in the hallway for a moment just letting the happiness of it occupy her completely, which was something she had not done in a very long time. Thomas arrived in late February, when the first hints of spring were beginning to appear in the form of a slightly less hostile quality to the afternoon air. He came on the morning stage from Dodge City, having ridden the train from Colorado to there, and Effie was standing outside the inn when the stage came in, which was unusual enough that Dora had looked at her twice before saying nothing. She recognized him from halfway down the road. He was taller than she had expected, or had remembered, or had not let herself remember. He had their father's walk, that particular way of moving as if the ground belonged to him in a friendly rather than proprietary sense. He was 28 now and had the sun and altitude of Colorado in him, brown and lean, and she saw when he came close enough, the same dark hair he had always had. He saw her. He stopped on the road for a moment. Then he came forward and she met him halfway, and he put his arms around her and she let herself be held by her brother. And she was not me Walsh, and she was not afraid, and she was standing on a main road in Caldwell, Kansas, on a morning in late February 1879, and she was Effie Grayson, and she was home, or as close to home as she had managed to be in 3 years. Thomas met Aaron that afternoon at supper. He assessed him with the particular attention of an older brother, asking him questions that were direct without being aggressive, about the marshal work and about his background and about his intentions, and Aaron answered all of them with the straightforward honesty that was his way, not performing for Thomas's benefit but not withholding either. Afterward, Thomas walked with Effie in the cold evening air and said that he liked him. "I like him also," Effie said, which was perhaps the least adequate description of how she felt about Aaron Ashford, but was all she was prepared to offer her brother until she had made up her own mind more completely. Thomas said, with the frankness that she remembered from his childhood, "You look like yourself again. I wasn't sure you would," she said after a moment. "I wasn't either." He stayed a week. It was, she thought, the best week she had had in years. They talked about their parents and about Thomas's work in Colorado and about the years that had passed and about Harlan Cole, which was a conversation they had once, carefully and without dramatizing it, and afterward she felt as if she had set down the last of a weight she had been carrying and left it on the road behind her. Thomas told her before he left that he intended to come back in the summer. She said she would be there. "Will you?" He said, and there was something in the question that was not entirely about geography. "Yes," she said, "I will be here." Spring came across the Kansas plains in the way it always did, which was to say suddenly and with conviction, the grass going from winter brown to a startling green in what seemed like a matter of days, and the sky doing that thing it does when it fully commits to blue. The cattle season was beginning to build again, and Caldwell was acquiring the particular energy of a town that has decided to take itself seriously, with new buildings going up on the main road, and a school that had been talked about for 2 years finally in the planning stages. Aaron was busy with the work of the territory, which meant he was sometimes away for several days at a time, and sometimes in the office from early morning to past dark. Effie did not mind this. She had spent 3 years dependent on no one, and while she was learning to let someone in, she was not learning to require someone's constant presence. She had her work and her correspondence with Thomas, and an expanding ease within herself that she spent time every day simply feeling, the way you feel the sun on your face when you step outside, aware of it and grateful. But when he was home, and when the evenings were long enough to allow it, they walked together and talked, and on a Sunday in April he took her out on horseback to a place north of town, where the prairie grass ran uninterrupted for as far as you could see, and they sat on a low rise in the late afternoon sun, and she thought about all the ways the world had expanded since October. He had been talking for some time about a stretch of land to the north of town, 20 acres of it that was going for a reasonable price, with a creek running through it and good grass. He had the money saved, more or less. He had been hesitant because 20 acres with a creek required a vision of a future that was more than just the next season, and he was a man who had been careful about such visions. He told her all of this, sitting on that rise with the late sun on the plains. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "You say that often," she said. "I find myself frequently wanting to ask you things," he said. He was looking at the grass. "I want to ask you whether you can imagine being my wife." The plain air moved around them. Somewhere a hawk was making circles on the thermals, high and patient. "Effie," he said, and he said it the way he always said her name, with all of it in it, the specific and complete person it named. "I am not asking you to give anything up. I am not asking you to become smaller than you are or to stop being anything you already are. I am asking whether you might want to build something with me." He turned to look at her. "I would like to spend my life with you. I think we would be very good at it." She looked at him, this man who had asked her name gently enough that she had given it back to herself, who had listened to the whole story without flinching and without pity, and who had asked nothing of her that she was not ready to give, and who had waited with the patience of a man who understood that waiting was not passive but was itself a form of care. She thought about the two-room house with the new shelf they had built together, and the view of the plains from the north window and 20 acres with a creek. She thought about her mother's letter. "You were so loud and so certain when you were born." "Yes," she said. "I believe we would." He took her hand, which was the first time he had done so, and they sat on the rise in the April sun with the enormous sky above them and the green Kansas plain all around. And she let herself feel it all, the grief and the relief and the gladness, the whole particular weight of arriving somewhere after a long journey. They were married in June of 1879, on a Saturday morning in the small church on the south end of Caldwell's main road, with Dora Haney standing as witness, and Thomas Grayson riding down from Colorado for the occasion. The morning was warm and the sky was very clear, and Effie wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself, because she was good with her hands, and also because she had wanted the dress to be hers in every sense. She kept the name Grayson. She became Effie Grayson Ashford, and she had her full name written correctly in the church register, and she looked at it there in the clean ink and felt the reality of it settle. Aaron looked at her across the small church, with an expression that she thought she would spend a long time learning all the details of, because it was the kind of face that revealed more the better you knew it. After the ceremony, they had supper at the Cottonwood Inn, which Dora had arranged with a generosity that expressed itself in the form of a particularly good roast and 3 different kinds of pie. Thomas made a toast that was warm and funny in equal measure, and Clara, who had come back from Dodge City for the occasion, cried in a way that she appeared to find embarrassing but that Effie found rather beautiful. In the evening, sitting on the step of the small house that was now their small house, with the June dark coming in across the plains and the stars beginning to appear, Aaron said, "I want to put a porch across the front of this house." Effie considered the front of the house. "It would need to be at least 10 feet wide to be useful. I was thinking 12. 12, she agreed. "Yes." They sat for a while in the good silence they had always been able to sit in. He said, "What do you want, Effie, for yourself, for the years ahead?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had been learning to think about things again, without fear as the primary lens. "I want the store," she said. It came out more definitively than she had expected, but it was true. She had been thinking about it for weeks, the empty building on the north end of the main road that had formerly been a dry goods store and had sat vacant since the previous winter. "I want to run it, properly, with good stock and fair prices and a place where people can come and find what they need." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." For a month at least, she looked at the dark plain. "Dora does not need me forever. She will not say so, but she is considering her sister's offer in Topeka, and the inn will not be what it was for much longer." She paused. "I know how to run a business. I know what this town needs. I have been watching and learning it for 2 years. "The Maddox building," he said, which was the empty store. "Yes, I think Maddox would deal," he said. "It's been sitting long enough." "I think so too." He smiled, and it was the particular smile she loved, the one that was fully open and entirely genuine, and had nothing held back from it. "Then we'll talk to Maddox," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the step of their house in the June dark with the enormous Kansas sky above them. And she thought about all of it, the whole long journey of the last 3 years, and she thought that arriving somewhere was not the end of the story. It was simply the beginning of a different one in which she was present and known and named. They talked to Maddox that week. The negotiation took less time than she had expected, partly because Maddox was genuinely eager to be rid of the building, and partly because Effie had gone into the conversation having done her arithmetic very carefully. They reached an agreement that was fair, and the papers were signed by the end of July. She spent the month of August turning the Maddox building into a store, which was an exercise in problem-solving and physical labor, and the particular pleasure of making something out of nothing. Aaron helped in the evenings and on Sundays, and Thomas sent a generous amount toward the stock, which he called a wedding gift and which she accepted because it was given from love and not from obligation. She opened in September, 1 year and a day after Aaron Ashford had first ridden into Caldwell. She had a sign made by the carpenter on the south end of town. It said, in clean letters, Grayson Ashford General Goods. She had wanted both names. She had wanted to be there completely. The store did well. She had been right about what the town needed, and she stocked it accordingly, and she ran it with the same competent fairness she had brought to everything else, and people came back because she was straight with them, and because she knew what she was talking about, and because there was something in the quality of the place that made them feel well treated rather than merely processed. Dora sold the inn in October to a couple from Missouri and moved to Topeka, which everyone had seen coming, and before she left she gave Effie a long and not especially demonstrative hug and said, "You did well, Effie," using her name without emphasis, as if she had always used it, as if Effie had always been there. Clara, who had been nervous about her future with the inn selling, was hired by Effie for the store, and she turned out to have a talent for the bookkeeping side of things that surprised everyone except Effie, who had suspected as much. The 2-room house became 3 rooms over the winter, when Aaron put up a second addition with help from the blacksmith next door, who turned out to be a capable amateur carpenter. They built the porch as planned, 12 feet wide as agreed, and it became the place where Effie sat in the early mornings with her coffee before the store opened, looking at the main road and the plains beyond it and the big sky above everything. In the winter of 1879, when the cold had come back across the plains, and the store was full of the particular warmth of a wood stove and well-stocked shelves, Effie found out she was pregnant. She sat with this information for a day before she told Aaron, not because she was uncertain about it, but because she wanted to hold it herself first, to turn it over and understand the shape of it. She thought about what it meant to bring a child into the world, and she thought about her mother and her mother's voice, and the way the letter had said you were so loud and so certain when you were born. She thought about Thomas and the fiddle music and the preserves. She thought about the things she wanted to give a child that she had been given, and the things she had not. When she told Aaron, he was sitting at the kitchen table doing paperwork, and he looked up at her and was very still for a moment. And then his face did that thing it did when something reached the deep part of him, and he stood up and came to her and took both of her hands in his and said, "Effie," just her name, but full of everything. Their son was born in July of 1880, on a Tuesday morning with the summer sun coming in through the window, and Aaron pacing the hallway in his good boots, which made her laugh even in the middle of everything else. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Fenter, said she had never had a laboring woman laugh before, but that it seemed to be helping. He was loud when he arrived. He was loud in the particular way of someone who had opinions about the world and intended to make them known. He had Effie's auburn hair and Aaron's brown eyes and a mouth that was already, she could tell, going to be the kind of mouth that asks a great deal of questions. Aaron held him in the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the window with the summer light on both of them, and he had the expression she had seen once, briefly, in the dining room of the Cottonwood Inn when she had mentioned the age of the traveling family's children, that wistful, wanting look, except now it was entirely resolved into something else, something complete. "What are we calling him?" he asked. She had thought about this. "Thomas," she said, and then his grandfather's name, which was Robert. Aaron looked up at her. "Thomas Robert Ashford," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked back at the child. "Hello, Thomas," he said, and Thomas, who had been briefly quiet for the first time since his arrival, opened his eyes and looked at his father with the complete and serious attention of someone who is taking everything in for the first time. Thomas Grayson came down from Colorado that fall and held his nephew and cried in a way that was utterly undisguised. And Effie sat beside him on the porch and put her arm through his, and they sat together in the October afternoon, the three of them and Aaron, watching the light come across the plains. She thought about how life arranges itself, how the terrible years had seemed in their middle like a permanent condition, and how impossible it had seemed, in those years, to imagine sitting on a porch in Caldwell, Kansas, with her brother and her husband and her son, in the middle of a life that was wholly and completely hers. She had not been able to imagine it. She had not dared to. But here it was, ordinary and real and full, the way good things are. Not perfect. Not without its difficulties and its hard mornings and the memories that still came occasionally like cold water through a crack, but real and hers, and built with her own hands and the hands of a man who had asked her name gently enough that she had given it back to herself. A second child came 3 years later, a daughter in November of 1883, small and dark-haired and fierce in the way of people who know their own minds from the beginning. They named her Ruth, after Effie's mother, and she lived up to it in every way the name required, which was to say she was patient and fierce and quietly certain of her own worth in a way that made Effie's chest ache with recognition. The store had grown by then. They had the whole building and had taken on a second adjoining space, and Clara was managing the accounts with a precision that freed Effie to focus on the buying and the relationships with the suppliers, which she was very good at. The town of Caldwell was growing, more settled now, less wild, with a proper school that both Thomas and later Ruth would attend, and a doctor's office and a newspaper, and the particular sense of a place deciding what it intended to become. Aaron was still the county marshal, though there was talk of elections and the possibility of a sheriff's race, which was a different kind of position with a different kind of permanence in it. He was respected in the territory in the way of men who do their work without needing to announce it, and he was known in Caldwell specifically as a man who was fair and who could be trusted, which was the reputation he had always been building toward, even if he had not known it. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1883, with Ruth just weeks old in her cradle and Thomas, who was 3, making determined attempts to climb everything in the house that could be climbed, Effie stood at the front window of the store, which she had come to check on something, and looked out at the main road of Caldwell. The afternoon light was coming in sideways, the October light that she had come to love for its particular quality of being both warm and clear at the same time, and the town went about its Sunday business in the unhurried way of things settled and continuing. Aaron came in through the front door, having been at the office, and came to stand beside her. "What are you looking at?" he asked. She thought about it. "Everything," she said. He stood beside her and looked with her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning? Tell me." "The first morning at the inn," he said. "You had the coffee pot and you had your hair up and you were reciting the menu like you were reporting for a commanding officer." She looked at him. "I was not." "You were exactly like that," he said. "Precise, like everything was a thing that needed to be managed." A pause. "I thought, now there is a woman who has been managing very hard things for a long time. And yet you kept coming back for breakfast," she said. "I kept coming back for breakfast," he confirmed. She looked back out the window. Thomas had appeared in the street, having apparently escaped the house through some means she would need to investigate, and was being collected by Aaron's deputy, a young man named Powell who was very good with children, and was now being carried back toward the house with every evidence of finding this a satisfying arrangement. "I am glad," Effie said, "that you came back." "I am glad," Aaron said, "that you were there." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the afternoon light of the store she had built with both names on the sign outside, watching their deputy carry their son back home through the October streets of Caldwell, Kansas, and the sky above the plains was the color of good things, wide and clear and open in every direction. And she was Effie Grayson Ashford, and she was here, and she was all of herself, and she was home. The years that followed were the kind that build quietly into something substantial, the way a house built well becomes, over time, not just walls and a roof, but a place that has accumulated warmth in its wood and familiarity in its corners. There were ordinary years and difficult years and years of particular abundance, and through all of them the name on the store's sign held, and the house on the north end of town held, and the life they had built together, which had begun with a question asked gently in a lamplit parlor, and a name spoken aloud for the first time in 3 years, held most of all. Ruth grew up with her mother's directness and her father's patience, which was a combination that made her very effective and occasionally exhausting. Thomas grew up with both names, Ashford in his daily life and Grayson in the stories his mother told him, so that he understood himself to be the product of a whole history, not just the years that were easy. He was loud and curious and had his grandfather's laugh, which Effie discovered one morning when he was 6 years old, and the sound of it came from the back room, and she stood very still in the kitchen for a moment, listening to it, and let herself miss her father and be glad that the laugh had not disappeared from the world. Thomas Grayson came every summer without fail, until he married a woman from Silverton named Elena, after which they both came, and in the years that followed they brought their own children, and the house in Caldwell acquired the particular noise of a family that has spread and returned and spread again. On the occasion of Effie and Aaron's 10th wedding anniversary, in June of 1889, Thomas organized a supper that Effie only discovered when she came home from the store to find her parlor full of people she loved. Dora Haney came from Topeka, older and broader and entirely unchanged in any essential way. Clara came with her husband, the man she had married 2 years prior, who ran the newspaper and who treated her, Effie had noted with satisfaction, with complete and unreserved respect. Aaron's sister came from Ohio with her husband and 2 of her 4 children, and she was exactly as Aaron had described her, practical and warm and entirely clear-eyed about the world. Effie stood in the doorway of her own parlor and looked at the room full of people, and she thought, not for the first time but with particular clarity, this is a life. This whole, specific, actual life, which had come from the morning she had left Clover Creek with her small bag and her fear and no name to call herself. She had not been able to see this from there. She had not been able to imagine it from there. But it had been there anyway, waiting at the other end of the years, patient as good ground. Aaron came to stand beside her. He was 40 years old and had more gray in his hair than brown now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He looked exactly like himself, which was the thing about him that had never changed. "You all right?" he asked. She looked at the room. Thomas and Elena in the corner with their baby. Ruth in the middle of everything as usual, age 5 and entirely convinced that the gathering had been arranged for her benefit. Clara laughing at something her husband had said, Dora eating her second piece of pie with the air of someone who has thoroughly earned it. "I am better than all right," Effie said. He took her hand. She held it. "Effie," he said. She looked at him. "Happy anniversary," he said. She squeezed his hand. 10 years, she said. "And however many more," he said. She looked back at the room, at all of it, at the life that was entirely hers and that she had built with her own hands and her own name, and she thought about a cold October morning and a woman on a kitchen step, and a question asked so gently that the answer had been possible. "However many more," she said. "Yes." And the October sky above Caldwell was wide and clear and blue, and the store sign on the main road read Grayson Ashford General Goods, and in the house on the north end of town, a family that had been built from courage and patience, and the particular grace of being asked the right question at the right time, gathered around a table, and was together home.